Every movie about John Gotti shows you the same 5 minutes of footage. The camel hair coat. The cameras outside the courthouse. 3 acquittals in a row, while reporters called him the Teflon Don. That's the version Hollywood sold you, and it's not wrong, it's just incomplete. Behind the suits was a man who broke almost every rule his own organization lived by, and the FBI agents who spent years bugging his hallway watched him do it in real time. A boss murdered without permission. A commission that never voted. A bug hidden in a stairwell that finally caught him saying the thing he should never have said out loud. These are 20 secrets about the Gambino family under John Gotti that the documentaries gloss over. Stay for number 1, because the tape that ended him wasn't supposed to exist at all. Number 20. The hit Outside Sparks was planned to be seen. On the evening of December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano and his driver Thomas Bellotti were shot dead on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, in front of walking traffic and rush hour crowds. Most mob hits happen quietly in a car, in a basement, somewhere a body can disappear for a while. This one was staged like theater. For shooters in trench coats and fur hats stood at the entrance and opened fire the moment Castellano's car pulled up, then walked away on foot into the crowd. That wasn't sloppy planning. Investigators who worked the case later concluded the public setting was deliberate. Gotti wanted the entire underworld to know within hours, not days, that the old boss was gone and a new order had arrived. He was reportedly parked nearby in a car with Sammy Gravano, watching it happen. A killing that visible sends a message no whispered rumor ever could. By the next morning, every family in the city knew exactly who had the nerve to do it, whether they'd approved it or not. Number 19. Gotti moved on the family's earning structure almost immediately. Killing a boss is the easy part. Keeping the crews loyal afterward is what actually determines whether a takeover survives. Gotti understood this, and he moved fast. Within days of Castellano's death, he began meeting with capos across the family's biggest earning crews, the construction rackets, the Kennedy Airport cargo operations, the Brooklyn and Queens loan sharking books, to make clear that tribute would keep flowing upward exactly as before, just to a new address. Castellano had been unpopular precisely because he stayed removed from street earners and leaned on construction industry deals that only benefited a small circle around him. Gotti's pitch to the capos was simple. Business as usual, except the guy at the top actually still comes from the street. That message mattered more than any formal ceremony. Crews that might have hesitated over how Castellano died stopped hesitating once their own earnings weren't touched. Sammy Gravano later testified that the speed of that transition, more than the murder itself, was what secured Gotti's position before anyone outside the family had time to organize against him. Number 18. The commission never voted on Castellano's murder, and that was the whole scandal. Here's the rule almost every mob movie skips over, because it's not cinematic. Under the informal code that governed the 5 families, killing a boss required approval from the commission, the ruling council made up of the heads of the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families. It existed specifically to prevent wars from breaking out over exactly this kind of unauthorized killing. Gotti never asked. Castellano was shot dead without a commission vote, without notice, without the ritual that was supposed to keep the entire structure from spiraling into open conflict. That single fact is why so many old-school members considered Gotti reckless rather than bold. He hadn't just killed a boss. He'd ignored the one process that existed to keep bosses from being killed over petty disputes. Several men who later testified against him, including Gravano, said this violation followed Gotti for his entire run, a permanent asterisk on his legitimacy that no courtroom acquittal ever erased inside the life itself. Number 17. The Genovese family's boss was furious, and he had a reason to be. Vincent Gigandi, boss of the Genovese family, was widely believed to have wanted Castellano dead too, for his own separate reasons involving construction industry territory. But wanting a rival gone and tolerating how it happened are different things. Word passed through underworld channels that Gigandi was livid about the manner of the hit, an unsanctioned public execution that could bring heat down on every family in the city, not just the Gambinos. Some accounts from later organized crime prosecutions describe an early, serious plan within Genovese circles to retaliate against Gotti directly for the breach of protocol. It reportedly never fully materialized, partly because Gigani was famous for playing incapacitated, wandering his neighborhood in a bathrobe to avoid prosecution, and open warfare would have undone years of that act. But the resentment didn't disappear. It simmered. Investigators who tracked commission-era politics say the friction between Gigani and Gotti shaped years of underworld maneuvering that the public never saw, all traceable back to one broken rule on a Manhattan sidewalk. Number 16. Frank DeCicco's murder was the retaliation that almost worked. If anyone wanted Gotti dead for the Castellano hit, they got remarkably close in April 1986. Frank DeCicco, Gotti's newly appointed underboss, was killed by a car bomb outside a social club in Brooklyn. Investigators have long believed the bomb was intended for Gotti himself, and that DeCicco simply happened to be the one standing near the car when it detonated. The suspected source of that bomb traces back to Genovese-linked associates, consistent with the theory that Gigani's faction was settling the score the commission process never got to settle formally. Gotti reportedly became almost paranoid about car bombs afterward, a method rarely used in traditional mob hits precisely because it's harder to control and easier to trace. He avoided routines, varied his routes, and leaned harder into public visibility as a kind of shield, on the theory that a famous face made for a much messier target than an anonymous one. The bombing never got fully solved in court, but inside the family, everyone understood exactly what message it had been trying to send. Number 15. Gotti installed himself without the traditional induction ceremony. Becoming boss of a mafia family traditionally involves more than muscle. There's a process, sponsorship from made men, informal consultation with capos, and public acknowledgement that carries weight precisely because it isn't handed out casually. Gotti largely skipped the customary deliberation. He simply acted like the boss immediately after Castellano's death, backed by the loyalty of the crews he'd already secured and the fact that nobody with enough standing was willing to challenge him directly in the days right after the hit. Some longtime members reportedly viewed this as another sign of Gotti's disregard for tradition, a boss who took the title by momentum rather than earned consensus. It worked in the sense that nobody stopped him, but several later informants described a family that never fully unified behind him internally, even while presenting a united front to the press and the public. The throne was his. The room never fully agreed he deserved it. Number 14. The FBI already had a dedicated squad watching the Gambinos before Gotti took over. Long before John Gotti became a household name, the FBI had assigned a specific unit, known internally as the Gambino Squad, to track the family's operations. Special Agent Bruce Mal led that squad for years and became one of the most persistent investigators in Gotti's life, present through nearly every major phase of the case. When Castellano was murdered, Mal's team didn't need to build a case from nothing. They already had years of surveillance photographs, informant reports, and financial records on the family structure. What changed after the hit wasn't the existence of federal attention, it was the intensity of it. A new, flashier boss who courted press coverage gave the squad a much easier target to photograph, follow, and build a public narrative around, which ironically fed directly into the prosecution strategy that eventually took him down years later. Number 13. Agents parked outside the Rave Night long enough to know it by heart. Gotti's headquarters for years was the Rave Night Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, a modest storefront that became one of the most surveilled buildings in New York law enforcement history. FBI agents and NYPD organized crime detectives ran rotating surveillance from apartments and vehicles nearby, cataloging who came and went, cross-referencing faces against known associates, and building a visual map of the entire family's chain of command just from who walked through that door and in what order. Over years of watching the same block, agents on the detail became familiar enough with the routine that they could often tell just from who showed up and how long they stayed, whether a meeting concerned a minor dispute or something more serious. That kind of pattern recognition doesn't come from one dramatic raid. It comes from thousands of quiet, unglamorous hours logging license plates and photographs that never make it into a movie trailer, but end up being exactly what wins a courtroom years later. Number 12. Gotti trusted an apartment above the club that wasn't actually clean. For a man obsessed with counter-surveillance, who had his own people sweep for bugs, and who avoided talking business inside cars or his own home, Gotti made one enormous miscalculation. He believed a specific apartment above the Rave Night, belonging to an elderly woman named Nettie Sorelli, was safe for private conversations because it sat outside his usual patterns and seemed like an unlikely target. It wasn't safe. The FBI obtained authorization and planted a bug there, and for a period in the late 1980s and early 1990s, some of the most incriminating conversations of Gotti's career were recorded in a room he trusted precisely because it felt disconnected from the club downstairs. The lesson investigators took from it afterward was almost philosophical. The most dangerous rooms are the ones a target has convinced himself are safe, because that's where the guard actually comes down. Number 11. The nickname Teflon Don was born from frustration, not admiration. The press loved calling Gotti the Teflon Don after he beat 3 separate criminal cases in the 1980s, but the phrase didn't originate as a compliment. It grew out of prosecutorial and law enforcement frustration, a shorthand for how charges kept failing to stick despite what agents believed was overwhelming evidence of his involvement in organized crime. Some of those early acquittals involved jury tampering and witness intimidation that only came to light later, which meant the nickname the media turned into a badge of cool was really describing a justice system being actively undermined. Gotti embraced the label publicly, smiling for cameras and playing into the myth because it served him. Every acquittal made him look untouchable to the crews below him, and untouchable bosses keep loyalty. But inside the Southern District Prosecutor's offices, the phrase was closer to gallows humor, an admission that something about how those trials kept collapsing needed fixing before it happened a 4th time. Number 10. The media strategy was reportedly deliberate, not vanity. The common read on Gotti's flashy public image, the tailored suits, the wave to cameras, the tabloid coverage, is that it was simple ego. Several people who studied him closely, including some investigators and later informants, described something more calculated sitting underneath the vanity. A famous face is a harder face to quietly eliminate. If Gotti became recognizable enough, sympathetic enough in tabloid coverage, valuable enough as a kind of folk anti-hero, both rival factions inside his own world and law enforcement itself would have to think twice about how they handled him, because too much public attention was already pointed his way. It's the same logic hostages sometimes use instinctively, becoming as human and visible as possible to the people who might hurt you. Whether Gotti consciously reasoned it out that clearly or simply enjoyed the attention and got lucky with the side benefit is genuinely debated among people who covered him. But the effect was real either way. For years, the spotlight functioned like armor. Number 9. Gravano's decision to flip came from watching Gotti talk on tape. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano was Gotti's underboss and one of the most feared enforcers in the family's history, personally involved in numerous killings. What eventually turned him wasn't a moral awakening. It was hearing, through prosecutors during pretrial proceedings, the actual recorded conversations from the Sorelli apartment, tapes where Gotti discussed Gravano's own actions in ways that suggested Gravano might be positioned to take a fall to protect Gotti's own exposure. Gravano has described the moment of hearing those tapes as a turning point, a realization that loyalty flowing upward wasn't being matched by loyalty flowing back down. He became one of the highest-ranking Mafia members in American history to cooperate with the government, and his testimony, combined with the wiretap evidence, became the foundation of the case that finally convicted Gotti in 1992. The betrayal cut both ways in the eyes of the underworld. Gravano broke the code by talking, but many believed Gotti broke it first, on tape, without realizing anyone was listening. Number 8. The recordings caught Gotti describing murders in his own voice. The evidence that ultimately sank Gotti wasn't circumstantial or secondhand. It was Gotti's own voice, recorded discussing violence with a level of detail no defense attorney could argue around. In conversations captured at the Sorelli apartment, Gotti can be heard talking about the killing of Gambino associate Robert DiBernardo and referencing his own role in decisions about who lived and who didn't within the organization. For a man whose entire courtroom legend rested on prosecutors never being able to make anything stick, those tapes were the exact opposite of his prior 3 trials. There was no witness for a defense team to discredit, no informant whose credibility could be picked apart in cross-examination. It was simply Gotti, in his own words, in a room he trusted, saying things that left almost no room for interpretation. The man who beat the system for years was ultimately beaten by his own recorded voice. Number 7. The 1992 trial moved the jury selection process specifically because of past tampering. After watching Gotti walk free 3 times, prosecutors and the court took unusual precautions for the 1992 trial. The jury was anonymous and partially sequestered, a step taken specifically because of the well-documented history of jury tampering and intimidation connected to Gotti's earlier cases. That decision alone tells you how seriously the legal system had come to treat the Teflon Don myth as a symptom of a broken process rather than proof of innocence. Combined with the wiretap evidence and Gambino's testimony, the protected jury removed one of the only tools that had reliably worked in Gotti's favor before. He was convicted on charges including racketeering and multiple murders, including the killing of Paul Castellano, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defense that had dismantled prosecutors for a decade had nothing left to work with. No jury to reach. No witness to discredit. Just a recording and a verdict. Number 6. John Gotti Jr. inherited a family that was already collapsing. When Gotti went to prison in 1992, leadership informally passed toward his son, John Jr., though Gotti reportedly continued attempting to direct family business from behind bars for a period, which itself created friction over lines of authority nobody had cleanly resolved. The organization Jr. inherited was hollowed out. Gambino's cooperation had exposed the inner workings of the family to prosecutors in unprecedented detail. Other members faced pressure to cooperate rather than risk similar fates, and the aggressive federal prosecution strategy built around organized crime statutes made continuing business as usual far riskier than it had been a decade earlier. Jr. was convicted on racketeering charges of his own in 1999. He later described, in interviews and court proceedings, wanting to leave the life behind entirely, a stark contrast to the father who built an entire public persona around embracing it. The empire that looked untouchable through the 1980s spent the 1990s being dismantled piece by piece by the same government it had spent years publicly humiliating. Number 5. Gotti's health became public in a way the family couldn't control. While incarcerated, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer, and unlike almost everything else about his life, this was not something publicity could manage or spin. Photographs and reports of his declining health circulated publicly, a stark contrast for a man whose entire image had been built on appearing invincible in tailored suits under courthouse lights. He died in June 2002 at a federal medical facility, still serving his life sentence, having spent his final decade completely removed from the public stage that had once seemed to protect him. There's a specific irony that people who studied his career kept returning to: the theory that fame and visibility functioned as armor, that being too well known to quietly disappear kept him safe from both rivals and prosecutors for years, ultimately meant nothing against cancer. It was the one adversary no lawyer, tape, or reputation could outmaneuver, and it ended things far more quietly than anyone who watched his courthouse years would have predicted. Number 4. The Gambino family's earning structure outlived its most famous boss. One detail that rarely makes it into the Gotti mythology is how much of the family's actual money-making infrastructure, the construction industry, racketeering, waste management ties, and labor union influence, had been built up over decades before Gotti and continued functioning in various forms well after his conviction. Prosecutors and investigative journalists who've tracked organized crime in New York for years have noted that families like the Gambinos didn't collapse the moment a famous boss went to prison. The public narrative loves a clean ending, a single dramatic downfall. The reality investigators describe is closer to a slow financial erosion over years, as federal prosecutors used the same racketeering statutes repeatedly against successive layers of leadership, making each subsequent generation's operation smaller and more cautious than the one before it. Gotti's era was the loudest chapter. It wasn't remotely the final one, even if it's the version that gets made into movies. Number 3. Some capos reportedly resented Gotti's visibility for putting their own operations at risk. Not everyone inside the family enjoyed watching their boss become a tabloid celebrity. Increased visibility for Gotti meant increased law enforcement attention across the entire organization, not just around him personally. Capos running quieter, more profitable rackets in construction, gambling, and loan sharking reportedly saw the constant media coverage as a direct threat to operations that had functioned for years specifically because they stayed out of the spotlight. A boss who wanted headlines was, from their perspective, dragging federal scrutiny onto businesses that depended on staying unremarkable. This tension rarely surfaced publicly, because openly criticizing a sitting boss carried obvious risk, but several later accounts from cooperating witnesses described simmering frustration among capos who felt Gotti's ego was costing the entire family far more in long-term exposure than his charisma was earning it in short-term loyalty and morale. Number 2. The Castellano hit reshaped how the FBI approached the entire 5 families for years afterward. Beyond the Gambino family specifically, the unauthorized, public nature of Castellano's murder became something of a case study for federal investigators studying how organized crime structures could destabilize from within. It demonstrated that the old informal rules governing the commission weren't as enforceable as either the families or law enforcement had previously assumed, which shifted prosecutorial strategy toward treating the entire multifamily structure as a single ongoing racketeering enterprise rather than 5 separate, self-policing organizations. That shift in legal theory, applying RICO statutes aggressively across family lines, is part of why the 1980s and 1990s saw such a dramatic wave of convictions across all 5 families, not just the Gambinos. In a strange way, Gotti's most famous and reckless decision, breaking commission protocol to seize power, ended up contributing to a legal strategy that helped dismantle the very system of families he'd once ruled the biggest piece of. Number 1. The tape that ended Gotti almost wasn't authorized in time. Here's the detail that gets buried under everything else. The wiretap authorization for the Sorelli apartment above the rave night required investigators to convince a judge there was sufficient legal basis to bug a private residence belonging to someone with no criminal record of her own, based on the argument that it was being used as an extension of Gotti's operational headquarters. That kind of authorization isn't automatic, and getting it wrong, or getting it too late, could have meant losing the conversations that ultimately built the entire 1992 case. Agents involved in the investigation have described the surveillance approval process as genuinely uncertain right up until it was granted, a legal argument that had to hold up specifically because the location wasn't Gotti's own home or the club floor itself, just a room above it that he trusted for entirely the wrong reasons. If that authorization had failed or arrived even a few months later, some of the most damaging recorded statements in American organized crime history might simply never have existed, and the Teflon Don nickname might have outlived the man who earned it by beating 3 trials in a row. So that's the version the movies leave out. Not a boss who was simply too smart to catch, but a family run on broken protocol from day one, watched for years by agents who knew the block better than most tenants did, and finally undone by a recording made in a room he trusted for exactly the wrong reasons. The suits and the courthouse smiles were real. So was the surveillance file underneath all of it. Which of these 20 facts surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments, because I actually read every one. If this kind of deep source breakdown is what you come here for, tap that like button and subscribe, because there are more untold organized crime stories coming, and we're not done digging. Until next time, watch who's listening.